The flak ceiling over the Japanese fleet was a solid wall of 25mm tracers and jagged black bursts that shredded the clouds into oily rags. Captain Richard Fleming was 24, a senior officer now only because the rest of his squadron was burning in the lagoon. He felt the 5G load compress his spine into the seat frame while the manifold pressure needle spiked deep into the red. His ragged breathing fogged the glass of his mask as he fought the vibration of the bucking yoke with raw, numbing fingers. He locked his vision on the gray steel of the Makuma and adjusted the trim. He simply held the dive. In August of 1941, the atoll functioned as a routine relay point for the Trans-Pacific Telegraph Line. The North Pacific was an endless expanse of sapphire, a world where the horizon blurred into a hazy seam between sea and sky. At the center of this vast emptiness sat Midway, a tiny atoll barely 6 miles in diameter, composed of 2 sun-bleached fragments of land known as Sand and Eastern Islands. In the late summer of 1941, the atoll still carried the lingering air of a sleepy Pacific outpost. For decades, it had been little more than a relay point for the underwater telegraph line stretching from Honolulu to Manila, and a manicured stopover for the Pan American Airways China Clipper. The white coral sands were the domain of the albatrosses, the famous goonie birds, whose clumsy, swaying dances provided the only real entertainment for the handful of civilians and cable operators stationed there. But the peace was a thin veneer. By August of 1941, the rhythmic sounds of the surf were increasingly drowned out by the mechanical roar of progress. The United States Navy had designated Midway second only to Pearl Harbor in strategic importance, and the transformation was brutal and swift. Massive seaplane hangars rose from the flat scrub of Sand Island, and the fuel storage tanks were buried deep beneath the dunes. On Eastern Island, a 5,300-foot airstrip was carved into the earth, a black scar of asphalt that signaled the end of the atoll's isolation. Commander Cyril T. Simard arrived to take command of the Naval Air Station with the weary eyes of a veteran flyer. He was a man who understood the weight of the wind and the temperamental nature of carrier decks, having served as air officer on the United States ship Langley. Beside him stood Lieutenant Colonel Harold D. Shannon, a Marine officer who carried the grit of the Great War and the dust of Nicaragua in the creases of his uniform. Shannon was a man of the earth, obsessed with interlocking fields of fire and the defensive utility of barbed wire. To a casual observer, the flyer and the grunt were an unlikely pair, but they meshed into a singular, effective unit. They shared a quiet, professional understanding. The atoll was no longer a transit point. It was a cork in a bottle, and they were the ones tasked with keeping it tight. Life on Midway settled into a grueling, sun-baked routine. The garrison, which would eventually grow to over 3,600 men, spent their days digging into the coral and their nights playing endless games of cribbage and hearts. The heat was a constant weight, and the smell of salt spray mingled with the sharp, oily scent of aviation fuel. They watched the goonie birds with a mixture of affection and envy, marveling at the creature's ability to ignore the looming shadow of global conflict. The illusions of the old world shattered at 6:30 in the morning on December 7th, 1941. The word came over the radio wires, cold and impossible. Pearl Harbor was under attack. The men on Midway stood at their stations, eyes fixed on the empty horizon, waiting for the ripple effect of the explosion 1,000 miles to the east. It did not take long to arrive. At 6:42 that evening, a Marine sentry on the beach squinted against the fading light and spotted a rhythmic flash far out at sea. It was not the friendly beacon of a returning clipper. 3 hours later, the silence of the night was torn apart by the thunder of 5-inch naval guns. The Japanese destroyers Sazanami and Ushio had crept within range, their silhouettes jagged black teeth against the moonlight. The first shells shrieked over the lagoon, slamming into the seaplane hangar on Sand Island. The explosion was a secondary sun, illuminating the terrified squawks of thousands of birds. A consolidated PBY Catalina flying boat, a graceful giant of the patrol service, was reduced to a blackened skeleton in seconds. The Pan American direction finder was smashed into silence. The Marines of the 6th Defense Battalion returned fire, their shore batteries barking back into the darkness, but the destroyers were phantoms, slipping away into the black swells of the Pacific by 10 o'clock. They left behind 4 dead defenders and 10 wounded, the first blood spilled on the white coral. The war had found Midway. In the wake of the raid, the atoll transformed into a hive of defensive industry. The men no longer lounged on the beaches. They lived in the earth. Shannon's obsession with fortifications intensified. He ordered miles of barbed wire strung along the reefs and beaches until the men joked that the old man expected to catch Japanese Zeros in the mesh. Blasting gelatin was rigged into makeshift mines and booby traps, hidden beneath the shallow turquoise waters of the lagoon. Reinforcements arrived in late December, but they were not the gleaming war machines the men had hoped for. Instead, the ferry Kitty Hawk and other transports brought the cast-offs of the carrier fleet. They were given 17 Vought Vindicator dive bombers and 14 Brewster Buffalo fighters. The pilots, many of them fresh from flight school, looked at the stubby, underpowered Buffaloes with a stoic resignation. In the carrier squadrons, these planes were being replaced by the faster Wildcats and Dauntlesses, but on Midway, the flying Coffins were the only shield available. They were organized into Marine Air Group 22, led by Lieutenant Colonel Ira Kimes, and they began a relentless cycle of anti-submarine patrols and combat drills. By the spring of 1942, the tension on the atoll had reached a humming electric pitch. Every man knew that the Japanese would not be content with a single night's shelling. Admiral Nimitz himself flew in for a personal inspection in early May, his presence a silent confirmation of the stakes. He walked the lines with Simard and Shannon, his blue eyes taking in the sandbags, the hidden gun emplacements, and the hand-felled scrub. He asked Shannon if he could hold the islands against a major amphibious assault. Shannon's reply was immediate and devoid of bravado. "Yes, sir." But the cost of preparation was high. On May 22nd, a freak accident involving a demolition charge sent 400,000 gallons of aviation fuel up in a towering column of black smoke. The explosion destroyed the distribution system, forcing the ground crews to refuel the planes by hand, heaving 55-gallon drums through the sand in the stifling heat. It was a back-breaking task that served as a constant reminder of their vulnerability. As May drew to a close, the PBY Catalinas of Patrol Squadron 44 began flying 700-mile arcs into the unknown. The pilots spent 15 hours at a time staring at the glare of the sun on the water, searching for the first sign of the approaching storm. On the ground, the men of the garrison checked their Browning machine guns and polished their bayonets. They were 3,600 souls on a tiny speck of dust, outclassed and isolated. But they were no longer a telegraph station. They were the undaunted defenders of the gate, and the horizon was no longer empty. The dawn of June 2nd, 1942 broke over Midway with a deceptive porcelain stillness. To the albatrosses nesting in the scrub, it was merely another Tuesday in the North Pacific. But for the 3,600 men of the garrison, the air carried an electric charge that prickled the skin. The tropical heat was already beginning to rise from the white coral, shimmering in waves over the blackened asphalt of the eastern island airstrip. There was a silence on the atoll, but it was not the silence of peace. It was the heavy, suffocating quiet of men who had spent weeks digging into the earth and were now waiting for the earth to shake. Since the catastrophic explosion on May 22nd, the rhythm of the base had changed. The 400,000 gallons of aviation fuel lost in that blast had left the defenders with a grueling, primitive task. Along the flight line, lines of sailors and Marines worked in grim, rhythmic unison, heaving heavy 55-gallon drums through the shifting sand. Without the automated distribution system, every gallon that entered a Buffalo or a Vindicator had to be pumped by hand. The scent of raw gasoline was a constant, dizzying presence, mingling with the salt spray and the sour smell of unwashed sweat. Knuckles were raw, stripped of skin by the metal rims of the drums, but no one complained. They knew the math of the Pacific. A plane without fuel was just a very expensive target. At the command center, the atmosphere was one of professional stoicism masking a profound underlying dread. Colonel Shannon and Captain Simard moved through the bunkers with the practiced calm of leaders who knew their men were watching for any flicker of doubt. The intelligence from the codebreakers had been specific. The Japanese were coming, and they were bringing the weight of the Imperial Navy with them. In the briefings, the news was delivered in the flat, understated tones of military necessity. The pilots of Marine Aircraft Group 22 sat on wooden crates, their faces masked in shadow. Among them were the newcomers, Lieutenant Langdon Fieberling's 6 TBF Avenger crews and Captain James Collins' 4 B-26 Marauder pilots. Most of the Avenger boys were fresh out of flight school. Some had never even flown out of sight of land until they were ordered to this speck of dust in the middle of nowhere. Simard stood before them, his eyes scanning the young faces. He spoke of the Japanese carriers, the Akagi and the Kaga, as if they were merely problems to be solved with geometry and courage. But there was a lie he had to maintain, a heavy secret shared only with the highest-ranking officers. He told the pilots not to expect help from the American carriers, claiming they were off defending Hawaii. It was a bitter pill to swallow. To the men in that room, Midway was the bait, and they were the ones tied to the hook. They were told their only chance was to strike the Japanese flight decks before the enemy could launch their own swarms. It required a monumental dose of luck and timing that felt impossible in the face of the vastness of the ocean. Outside, the physical preparations reached a fever pitch. In the lagoon, the 11 PT boats bobbed in the turquoise water, their crews checking the belts on their 50 caliber machine guns. On the beaches, Shannon's barbed wire obsession had turned the island into a cage. Mines were submerged in the shallows, their detonators waiting for the touch of a Japanese landing craft. Beside the genuine gun emplacements, the Marines had constructed the JFU, the Jap Fowler-Upper, a decoy plane made of crates and tin roofing designed to draw enemy fire. It was a grim joke, a bit of gallows humor that the men clung to as they checked their sights and counted their rounds. The morning of June 3rd brought the first crack in the waiting. At 9:04 a.m., the radio in the Sand Island bunker crackled to life. Ensign Charles Eaton, patrolling 470 miles out, reported 3 ships. But the real bolt from the blue came 21 minutes later. Ensign Jack Reed, piloting a PBY-5A Catalina 700 miles west of the atoll, saw a cluster of specks on the horizon. At first, he and his co-pilot, Gerald Hardiman, thought they were looking at dirt spots on the windshield. Reed wiped the glass, but the spots remained. They grew larger, sharper, turning into the silhouettes of a massive armada. "Sighted main body," Reed's voice came through the static, steady despite the adrenaline. He began tracking the column, reporting 6 large ships, then 11, moving at 19 knots on a course of 090 degrees. The news rippled through Midway like a physical blow. The waiting was over. By 12:30 p.m., the order was given to launch the heavy hitters. 9 B-17 Flying Fortresses, led by Lieutenant Colonel Walter Sweeney, roared down the eastern island runway. The heavy bombers, laden with 600-pound bombs, strained against the heat, their 4 engines screaming as they lifted off just before the coral gave way to the sea. For 3.5 hours, the crews sat in the vibrating metal bellies of their planes, the Pacific an endless blue carpet beneath them. When they finally found the Japanese ships, the sight was panoramic, an astonishing array of surface vessels that seemed to stretch from horizon to horizon. Sweeney led them in from out of the sun, the B-17s leveling off at high altitude. From the cockpit, the release of the bombs was a silent, graceful thing. But as they tumbled toward the zigzagging ships below, the sky erupted in the dirty gray puffs of ack-ack. Sweeney reported seeing 2 ships burning, the smoke rising in thick columns. But as the bombers turned for the long trek home, the reality was more harrowing. They had scored no hits. The Japanese ships remained an intact, lethal threat. The return flight was a test of endurance. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the B-17s were running on fumes, their fuel gauges hovering near empty. On Midway, the garrison blacked out the islands, leaving only the faintest lights to guide the bombers in. One by one, the fortresses touched down, the last one landing at 9:45 p.m. under a canopy of stars. The pilots climbed out, their legs shaking from the vibration of the yoke and the long hours of tension. They were exhausted, but there was no time for rest. In the darkness of the barracks, men did not sleep. They performed small private rituals. Some cleaned their sidearms for the 10th time. Others wrote letters they feared would never be mailed. They spoke in low murmurs about the zeros they expected to see at dawn. The transition from the electric tension of the previous weeks to the cold certainty of combat had been completed. As the clocks ticked toward the early hours of June 4th, the defenders of Midway sat in their dugouts and cockpits, listening to the surf and the distant, haunting cries of the Goonie birds, knowing that when the sun rose again, the world would never be the same. The summons came at 3 o'clock in the morning on June 4th, 1942, a sharp, cold jar to the senses that felt more like a sentence than a wake-up call. There was no sunrise, only a bruised, purple twilight that clung to the dunes of Sand Island. The air was thick with the scent of salt water and the oily, heavy musk of idling Pratt & Whitney engines. For the men of the Midway garrison, reveille was a ghost-like affair. They moved through the bloom with the practiced, somber efficiency of sailors who knew the horizon was no longer empty. By 4 o'clock, the first 6 Grumman F-4F Wildcats from Major Floyd Red Park's Marine Fighter Squadron 221 were clawing into the damp air, followed by 11 PBY Catalinas. The Cats fanned out into the gray void, their crews straining their eyes against the glare of the coming sun, searching for the jagged silhouettes of the Japanese Imperial Navy. The morning remained a taut wire until 5:30. Lieutenant Howard 80, piloting a PBY 400 miles out, banked his massive flying boat through a towering bank of clouds and found what every man on the atoll had been dreaming of and fearing in equal measure. There, spread across the sapphire water like a lethal carpet, was Vice Admiral Nagumo's first striking force. 80's radio transmission was a lightning bolt through the static. Carrier bearing 320 degrees, distance 180. Minutes later, the report was amplified. It wasn't just the ships. A massive formation of Japanese aircraft was already in the air, a swarm of 108 planes, torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters, all steering a direct course for Midway. On the atoll, the air raid sirens began their rising, mournful wail at 5:53. The sound was a physical weight, pressing the men into their dugouts and gun pits. Major Parks didn't wait. He led his 21 Brewster F-2A-3 Buffaloes and 6 Wildcats into the sky, a desperate scramble that saw every available American plane airborne by 6:16. The Buffaloes were stubby, underpowered machines, already considered flying coffins by the men who flew them, but they were the only shield the Marines had. As they climbed toward the intercept point, the cockpits grew stiflingly hot, the smell of hydraulic fluid and cordite-tinged air filling the small spaces. Captain John Carey, leading a flight of 3 Wildcats, was the first to see the enemy. The Japanese formation was a terrifying sight. A massive V-shape of Nakajima B-5N2 Kate torpedo bombers, trailed by gaggles of Aichi D-3A1 Val dive bombers, all protected by a lethal screen of Mitsubishi A6M2 Zeros. Carey's voice crackled over the radio, tight and urgent. "Tally-ho! Hawks at Angels 12!" Carey rolled his Wildcat into a screaming dive. the airframe groaning as the airspeed indicator swept past 250 knots. He centered a Kate in his sights and squeezed the trigger on his 4 50-caliber machine guns. The heavy rounds tore through the Japanese bomber, which disintegrated into a spectacular blossom of orange flame. But the triumph was fleeting. Within seconds, the escorting Zeros were on him. The Japanese fighters were not just faster, they were supernatural in their maneuverability. Carey felt the rhythmic thud of 20mm cannon shells slamming into his fuselage. Pain flared in his legs as shrapnel raked the cockpit, but he fought the yoke, hauling the heavy Wildcat into the clouds to lose his pursuers. Behind him, the massacre of the buffaloes had begun. To the observers on the ground, the air battle looked like a frantic, uneven dance. The buffaloes were hopelessly outclassed. One Marine later remarked that the American fighters looked as though they were tied to a string, while the Zeros made effortless passes around them. Major Parks and 4 other Marines were killed in the opening minutes, their planes spinning out of the sky like burning leaves. Lieutenant Daniel Irwin, one of the few to survive the initial pass, felt his buffalo shudder as Zero gunnery riddled his tail section. He managed to limp back toward the atoll, the smell of his own burning engine filling his mask. But the sky behind him was littered with the debris of his squadron. By 6:30, the battle shifted from the sky to the sand. PFC Philip Clark, stationed at Battery D on Sand Island, watched the horizon through the heat haze. The Japanese formations appeared first as 3 wisps of clouds, but they rapidly resolved into the terrifying geometry of an organized strike. "Open fire when targets are in range," the command echoed from the 6th Defense Battalion headquarters. A minute later, the atoll erupted. The sound was a relentless, chest-thumping roar. The 5-inch and 3-inch coastal guns, along with every 30-caliber and 50-caliber machine gun on the islands, began throwing a carpet of lead into the sky. The air was filled with the dirty gray puffs of ack-ack. A Kate torpedo bomber, its engine already trailing a thin ribbon of smoke, erupted into a fireball and plunged directly into the lagoon, missing the bobbing PT boats by mere yards. Another bomber struck Sand Island, the impact triggering a secondary explosion that sent 3 fuel tanks skyward in a pillar of oily black soot. The raid on Eastern Island began with a moment of surreal bravado. An eyewitness watched in stunned silence as the lead Japanese plane peeled off from the formation, dived to a mere 100 feet above the ground, and proceeded to fly leisurely upside down over the ramp. For a few heartbeats, the Marines were too surprised to fire. Then, a dozen machine guns found their mark, and the plane tumbled into the coral in a heap of twisted aluminum. The Val dive bombers were less theatrical and far more deadly. They shrieked down from the clouds, their fixed landing gear giving them the appearance of predatory birds. One bomb struck the VMF-221 arming pit, killing 4 mechanics instantly and detonating 10,000 rounds of 50-caliber ammunition in a frantic, stuttering chain reaction. Another Val demolished the Eastern Island powerhouse, plunging the bunkers into darkness and silencing the water distillation plant. The smell of high explosives and scorched earth became a suffocating blanket. On the ground, men fought back with whatever they had. Major Dorn Arnold gripped a Browning automatic rifle, spraying lead at the low-flying Vals, while another sailor on Sand Island stood in the open, emptied his Colt 45 pistol at a passing Zero, his face a mask of defiance. The attack was a whirlwind of violence that lasted only 18 minutes. By 6:48, the Japanese planes were banking away to the west, leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. On Midway, the all-clear didn't sound until 7:15, and the silence that followed was heavier than the noise of the bombs. The defenders emerged from their foxholes to a world transformed. The seaplane hangar was a blackened ribcage of steel. The oil fires on Sand Island sent a plume of smoke thousands of feet into the air, a funeral shroud for the morning. The toll was staggering. Kimes ordered the remaining fighters to land, but only 6 Buffaloes staggered back to the cratered runways. Of the 27 fighters that had scrambled an hour earlier, 15 buffaloes and 2 wildcats were gone. 13 pilots were dead. Only 1 wildcat and a single buffalo were deemed fit to fly again. The mechanics moved among the returning planes, their faces etched with grease and grief, looking at the jagged holes where 20-millimeter shells had punched through the thin skin of the aircraft. Yet, as the smoke cleared, the resilience of Colonel Shannon's preparations became clear. His elaborate network of trenches, bunkers, and sandbagged revetments had held. Only 11 ground defenders had been killed. Most of the aircraft caught on the ground were decoys, the Jap Fowler-uppers, made of crates and tin that now lay in splinters, having successfully drawn the enemy's fire. The runways on Eastern Island, though peppered with small craters, were still operational. The garrison had survived the first blow, but there was no time for relief. As the wounded were carried to the aid stations and the remaining pilots stood by their battered planes, every man knew that the Japanese carriers were still out there, unhurt and reloading. The air over the atoll was thick with the copper taste of spent cartridges and the lingering heat of the fires. The defenders of Midway stood their ground, looking toward the west, waiting for the next movement in a battle that had only just begun. The first strike was over, but the cost of the gate was already being measured in the lives of the young men who had tried to hold the sky. As the smoke from the first Japanese air raid still hung in heavy, oily coils over the shattered hangars of Midway, the second act of the morning's tragedy was unfolding hundreds of miles to the northwest. While the ground crews on the atoll were frantically dragging the wounded to safety and shoveling coral over burning fuel pits, the 52 aircraft they had sent out earlier were finally closing in on the Japanese carriers. For the young men in those cockpits, many of whom had never seen the flash of an enemy gun before that day, the Pacific had become a vast, blue trap. The coordination that had been planned in the quiet bunkers of Sand Island was the first casualty of the morning. Instead of a unified strike, the Midway-based bombers arrived in ragged, desperate waves, each one more isolated than the last. At 7:10 in the morning, Lieutenant Langdon Fieberling led his 6 new Grumman TBF Avengers into the heart of the Japanese fleet. The Avengers were powerful machines, but they were heavy with their torpedoes and lacked the agility to dance with the swarms of Mitsubishi Zeros that were already circling the carriers like hornets. As the TBFs dropped to a mere 100 feet above the water, the Japanese combat air patrol descended with a ferocity that defied description. The sky was suddenly crisscrossed with the white ribbons of tracer fire and the dark, smudged puffs of shipboard ack-ack. Fieberling's group never stood a chance. The Zeros, far faster and more nimble, banked into the American formation with clinical precision. The first TBF vanished in a violent orange blossom of flame, its wings shedding like autumn leaves before the fuselage tumbled into the whitecaps. Within minutes, 4 more followed. Ensign Albert Ernest, flying the only TBF to survive the initial pass, felt his aircraft shudder as 20-millimeter shells punched through the thin aluminum skin behind his seat. His turret gunner was killed instantly, and his radio man collapsed, severely wounded. With his elevator wires shot away and his hydraulic system shredded, Ernest loosed his torpedo at a cruiser, a desperate, blind shot, and hauled back on the yoke with every ounce of his strength. He turned back toward Midway, navigating by guess and by God, his engine coughing oil over a windshield that was already starred by bullets. Behind the TBFs came the 4 Martin B-26 Marauders, led by Captain James Collins. These were Army medium bombers, never intended for the delicate, suicidal art of torpedo bombing. Yet Collins and Lieutenant James Murray pressed their attack with a terrifying resolve. They dropped to 200 feet, the heavy twin-engine bombers vibrating so violently that the instruments on the panels became a blur. Murray's plane, riddled by Zeros and raked by the intense fire of the carrier Akagi's escort ships, became a target for every gun in the Japanese fleet. Collins released his torpedo at 850 yards, but Murray, driven by a raw survivalist instinct, pressed closer. He released his fish at 450 yards, and then, instead of banking away, he flew directly down the middle of Akagi's flight deck. For a few heartbeats, the Japanese sailors on the carrier's deck could see the face of the American pilot through the cockpit glass. Mori's Marauder roared over the length of the ship, its tail gunner spraying the deck with .50 caliber fire. As the B-26 cleared the carrier, the Zeros ganged up on it, wounding 2 more crewmen and punching hundreds of holes in the wings and fuselage. Despite the punishment, both Collins and Mori managed to stagger away from the fleet, the only 2 survivors of their 4-plane group. They had survived a gauntlet of fire, but as they looked back, they saw no explosions on the Japanese ships. The torpedoes had missed. The crisis intensified at 7:48 when Major Lofton Henderson arrived with 16 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241. Henderson was a veteran, a man who led by example, but his squadron was a mixture of old hands and boys who were still learning the feel of the yoke. He had divided them into 2 flights, but the faster Dauntlesses had pulled away from the aging Vindicators. Henderson spotted the carriers Kaga and Hiryu through a break in the clouds and radioed a final, steady command. "Attack the 2 enemy CV on the port bow." As the Dauntlesses began their long, steep glides from 4,000 feet, the Japanese Zeros fell upon them. The Marines had no fighter protection. They were naked against the fastest interceptors in the world. Henderson's plane was hit almost immediately. His port wing erupted in a plume of fire that trailed behind him like a funeral shroud. The Major tried to keep his burning aircraft in the lead, a steady beacon for his men, but the fire consumed the control surfaces. The Dauntless dipped its wing, rolled, and plunged into the sea in a spectacular geyser of white water. Captain Elmer Glidden took command, leading the remaining 10 bombers into a layer of clouds to escape the Zeros, but the relief was temporary. They emerged only to find themselves bracketed by a wall of flak so thick it looked like a physical barrier. They released their bombs at 500 feet, dangerously low, and pulled out with their engines screaming. 3 more SBDs were chewed to pieces by Zeros before they could even reach the horizon. High above the carnage, at 20,000 feet, Lieutenant Colonel Walter Sweeney led 15 B-17 Flying Fortresses over the Japanese fleet. From that altitude, the scene was panoramic and strangely beautiful, a vast array of warships carving white wakes across the deep blue of the Pacific. It looked, as one pilot recalled, like the greatest array of surface vessels any of us had ever seen. Each 3-plane element of B-17s targeted a carrier, dropping their 600-pound bombs in synchronized patterns. Sweeney believed he saw a hit on the Kaga, reporting heavy smoke billowing from her stern. But from 4 miles up, the perspective was deceptive. The Japanese ships, maneuvering with practiced ease, had simply sidestepped the falling steel. The great forts turned back for Midway, their crews frustrated and weary, unaware that not a single bomb had found its mark. The final, most heartbreaking act of the morning belonged to the 11 Vought SB-2U-3 Vindicators, led by Major Benjamin Norris. The Vindicators were obsolete, nicknamed vibrators because the fabric on their wings tended to flap and tear at high speeds. Norris, a realist, knew his slow, fabric-covered planes would never survive a dive through the Japanese cap to reach the carriers. He made a split-second decision to attack the nearest target of opportunity, the battleship Haruna. The Vindicators entered a high-speed glide, the wires in their wings humming a mournful tune as they descended through an extremely heavy and troublesome barrage of anti-aircraft fire. The battleship looked like a fortress, its deck a forest of flashing guns. Norris and his men dropped their bombs, claiming 2 direct hits and 3 near misses. In reality, the bombs splashed harmlessly in the wakes of the giant ship, leaving the Haruna unscratched. Norris managed to lead his men back into the safety of the clouds, but the victory was purely one of survival. By the time the last Vindicator ditched its bomb and turned for home, the silence over the Japanese fleet was absolute. Midway had sent 52 aircraft, the very heart of its air defense, against the enemy. 19 of them now lay at the bottom of the Pacific, or were scattered in pieces across the waves. The survivors were limping back to an atoll that was still burning, their fuel gauges flickering on empty, their cockpits slick with the blood of their gunners. Back on Eastern Island, the scene was one of grim, desperate calculation. As the ragged remnants of the squadrons began to drop onto the cratered runways, Major Kimes and Colonel Shannon stood by the flight line, counting the tails. One by one, the planes staggered in. 6 Dauntlesses, 7 Vindicators, a single Buffalo, and a lone Wildcat. The mechanics moved among the aircraft in a daze, looking at the jagged holes, the shredded rudders, and the empty seats. The realization began to sink in like a cold stone. They had thrown everything they had at the Japanese, and the Japanese were still coming. Only a handful of flyable aircraft were left to defend the atoll. The pilots who climbed out of their cockpits were hollow-eyed, their flight suits soaked in sweat and grease, too exhausted even to speak. They had faced the most powerful naval force in history with flying coffins and hand-pumped gas, and they had been broken against its hull. As the sun climbed higher into the June sky, the defenders of Midway braced themselves for the second air raid they were certain was coming. They sat in their trenches and stood by their remaining guns, watching the western horizon with a stoic, quiet dread. They didn't know that, far to the east, the American carriers Enterprise and Yorktown were finally making their move. All they knew was that the gate was still theirs to hold, and that the price of holding it was becoming higher than any of them had ever imagined. The afternoon of June 4th, 1942, descended upon Midway like a heavy, stifling shroud. On the atoll, the frantic chaos of the morning's air raid had given way to a grueling, mechanical kind of labor. The fires in the fuel tanks on Sand Island were still burning, sending a thick, greasy finger of smoke miles into the pale sky, but the sirens had finally fallen silent. The only sounds remaining were the distant, rhythmic crash of the Pacific surf and the occasional jarring clank of a shovel hitting coral as Marines worked to repair the pockmarked runways on Eastern Island. Major Kimes stood near the flight line, his eyes stinging from the soot and the relentless glare of the sun. He looked at the ragged remnants of his command. 6 Douglas SBD Dauntlesses, 7 Vought Vindicators, a single Brewster Buffalo, and 1 lone Grumman Wildcat. It was a pathetic force to hold against a 4-carrier task force, and yet the men were still working. They moved in a daze of exhaustion, their flight suits stiff with dried salt and sweat, their hands shaking as they attempted to refit the battered planes with whatever spare parts could be salvaged from the wrecks. There was no talk of victory. There was only the grim preparation for the second wave of Japanese planes they all believed would arrive before sunset. Then, at 3:58 in the afternoon, the silence of the radio bunker was shattered. A PBY Catalina pilot circling hundreds of miles to the northwest sent a transmission that rippled through the command center like a physical shock. "Sighted 3 burning ships," the voice crackled through the static. Colonel Shannon and Captain Simard exchanged a quick, wary glance. For a moment, no one dared to breathe. They had sent everything they had into the morning's furnace and seen nothing but their own boys falling. They waited, the tension in the room thickening until it was nearly unbearable. At 5:45, the pilot's voice returned, clearer this time, carrying a note of disbelief that mirrored their own. "The 3 burning ships are Jap carriers." The news spread through the trenches and gun pits, not as a shout, but as a low, humming vibration. The American carriers, the Enterprise and the Yorktown, had found the mark that the Midway-based pilots had missed. The Akagi, the Kaga, and the Soryu were death-stricken, their flight decks turned into infernos by the dive bombers from the fleet. The realization that they were no longer alone, that the bait had finally drawn the predators into a trap, brought a sudden, stinging moisture to the eyes of men who had spent the morning preparing to die. But the battle was not over. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, 15 Boeing B-17 Flying Fortresses arrived from Hawaii, joining the remnants of the Midway group for a final, desperate strike at the last remaining Japanese carrier, the Hiryu. The heavy bombers roared over the atoll, their four-engine symphonies providing a temporary sense of power to the exhausted garrison. They claimed hits on the burning carrier and even a destroyer, though in the gathering twilight the accuracy of high-altitude bombing remained as elusive as it had been in the morning. As night fell, the atoll settled into a state of suspended animation. The electric tension of the previous weeks had been replaced by a cold, watchful alertness. Simard ordered the PBYs to disperse and warned the PT boat crews to expect a night invasion. Non-essential personnel were evacuated to the bunkers, and the Marines of the 6th Defense Battalion lay in their foxholes with their fingers on the triggers of their Browning machine guns, staring into the black swells of the lagoon. The silence was broken at 1:20 in the morning. The Japanese submarine I-168 surfaced in the darkness and opened fire with its 5-inch deck gun. The shells shrieked over the water, the flashes of the submarine's gun appearing like jagged sparks on the horizon. The Marines did not hesitate. Battery B and Battery E on Eastern Island, along with Battery D on Sand Island, barked back with their 3-inch and 5-inch coastal guns. For 8 frantic minutes, the atoll and the submarine exchanged fire, 42 American shells lobbing into the dark sea while the submarine fired 8 back. Most of the Japanese shells fell harmlessly into the lagoon, sending up geysers of white water that looked like ghosts in the moonlight. By 1:28, the submarine submerged, slipping away into the depths, and the silence returned. It felt like a dying gasp, a final, spiteful gesture from an enemy that realized the tide was beginning to turn. June 5, 1942 began at 4:15 in the morning with a report from the submarine Tambor. A large enemy force had been spotted within striking distance. The garrison stood too, the pilots of Marine Aircraft Group 22 climbing into their cockpits for what they feared would be the final stand. 8 B-17s scrambled into the early morning fog, their crews searching for the phantom invasion fleet. For 2 hours, the atoll held its breath. At 6:30, the word finally came. A PBY pilot reported sighting 2 battleships bearing 256 degrees, distance 125 miles. But the crucial detail followed seconds later. Ships damaged, streaming oil. The battleships were actually the heavy cruisers Mikuma and Mogami, which had collided in the darkness while trying to flee the area. The Japanese were not invading. They were retreating. A collective sigh of relief, so profound it seemed to vibrate the very sand swept through the islands. Captain Marshall Tyler led 6 Dauntlesses, and Captain Richard Fleming led 6 Vindicators in pursuit of the oil slick. They found the cruisers limping westward, their wakes stained with the black blood of their engines. The Marines attacked through a wall of flak that remained extremely heavy and troublesome. Fleming, a pilot who had spent the entire battle displaying a quiet, unbreakable courage, led his Vindicators out of the sun. As he began his dive, his engine began to smoke, a thin ribbon of gray that quickly turned into a roar of orange flame. His wingman, Captain Leon Williamson, watched in horror as Fleming's vibrator became a torch. But Fleming did not pull out. Either by a final, superhuman act of will or the cruel design of physics, he steered his blazing aircraft directly into the aft 8-inch gun turret of the Mikuma. The explosion was a spectacular final punctuation mark to the morning. The fire from Fleming's plane was sucked into the cruiser's starboard engine room air intakes, suffocating the engineers and leaving the ship a drifting wreck. It was the first act of its kind in the battle, a moment of supreme sacrifice that left the surviving pilots in a state of stunned, reverent silence as they turned back toward Midway. As the bombers landed and the crews climbed out, the atmosphere on the atoll began to shift. The transition from the hurry up and wait of the morning to the realization of a secured perimeter brought with it the first moments of true, heavy silence. The smell of the burning hangar was still there, but it was no longer the smell of defeat. Men sat on the edges of their trenches, their helmets between their knees, listening to the surf. The PBYs and PT boats were already heading out, not to search for an enemy, but to find their own. Between June 4th and June 9th, the Cats would pick up 27 downed airmen from the vast, indifferent Pacific. Each time a pilot was brought back to the docks, a small cheer would go up, a fragile sound in the face of the thousands who would not return. By the evening of June 5th, the defenders of Midway knew they had held the gate. The cost had been staggering. The heart of their air group had been cut out, and the islands were a graveyard of twisted metal and scorched earth. But the Japanese fleet was gone, their carriers at the bottom of the sea, and the invasion force had vanished into the western horizon. As the stars came out over the North Pacific, the men of the garrison sat in the quiet, watching the Goonie birds return to their nests in the scrub, realizing that they had not only survived the storm, but had somehow managed to break its back. By the morning of June 7th, 1942, the North Pacific sun had returned to its relentless, diamond-bright clarity. The heavy, suffocating curtains of black oil smoke that had draped Midway for 3 days were finally beginning to thin, carried away by a gentle breeze that smelled once more of salt spray and coral. For the men of the garrison, the electric tension that had defined their lives since May had vanished, replaced by a profound, bone-deep exhaustion that made every movement feel as though it were occurring underwater. The islands of Sand and Eastern were no longer the vibrant hubs of an impending clash. They were a scarred and battered landscape of twisted steel, charred hangars, and the quiet, rhythmic sounds of the Pacific reclaiming its silence. Captain Cyril Simard stood on the edge of the lagoon, his eyes shaded by his cap, watching the slow, lumbering return of a PBY Catalina. The Cats had been in the air almost constantly since the retreat of the Japanese fleet, fanning out across hundreds of square miles of empty ocean to find the men the battle had left behind. This was the work of the aftermath, not the high-octane terror of a dive-bombing run, but a slow, methodical scouring of the swells. Between June 4th and June 9th, these patrol planes and the small, bobbing PT boats would pull 27 airmen from the drink. Each man brought back was a small victory against the vastness of the sea, a fragile life reclaimed from the statistics of the missing. Yet the fog of war lingered even in the hours of victory. On June 6th, only a day earlier, Simard had dispatched 26 B-17s to find reported Japanese cruisers heading southwest. The massive bombers had roared off the eastern island strip, their crews eager for one last strike. They had found a target and dropped their heavy bombs, reporting a direct hit on a cruiser that sank in seconds. But as the reports were cross-referenced in the quiet of the command bunker, the grim reality emerged. The cruiser had actually been the United States ship Grayling. The submarine had been forced to submerge in a hurry to escape the friendly fire of the flying fortresses. It was a sobering reminder that even in triumph, the mechanical chaos of modern war was a blind and clumsy beast. The physical cleanup of the atoll was a task of immense proportions. Colonel Shannon's Marines, their faces etched with the grime of the trenches and the lack of sleep, began the work of dismantling the Jap Fowler-uppers, those clever decoys made of crates and tin that had successfully drawn so much of the enemy's fire. They filled in the craters on the runways with shovels and sweat, and they began the long process of inventorying the ammunition dumps that had been scattered across the islands. The barbed wire, Shannon's great obsession, still sprouted along the coral beaches like a rusted metallic weed, a testament to the defense that was never fully tested by a landing force. In the mess halls and the barracks, the atmosphere was one of a somber, understated stoicism. Men sat at the long wooden tables, eating their rations in a silence that was far louder than the roar of the 5-inch guns had been. The absences were everywhere. In the quarters of Marine Fighter Squadron 221, the rows of empty bunks were a physical weight. Of the 27 fighters that had scrambled into the dawn on June 4th, only a handful of battered airframes remained, and even fewer pilots. Major Parks and his men had been the first line of the gate, and they had paid the entry fee in full. The story was the same for Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241. The crews spoke in low, reverent tones of Major Lofton Henderson, whose name would soon be etched into the history of the Corps, and of Captain Richard Fleming. Fleming's final blazing dive into the aft turret of the Makuma had already become the stuff of legend among the ground crews. They spoke of how his Vindicator had been a torch in the sky, and how he had steered it with a final, superhuman act of will. There was no medals talk yet. That would come later from the desk-bound officers in Pearl Harbor, but among the men who had seen the smoke on the horizon, Fleming was already a ghost of the atoll, a guardian who had given everything to ensure the Japanese retreat. Captain Simard and Colonel Shannon met one last time in the dim light of the command bunker to finalize their reports. They were different men than the ones who had stood before Admiral Nimitz in May. The promotion to full colonel and captain felt like a distant secondary thing compared to the weight of the 3,600 lives they had managed to hold on to the edge of the world. Shannon, the veteran of the Great War, looked at the maps spread across the table, the lines of the reef, the positions of the batteries, the arcs of the search planes. He had promised Nimitz they could hold Midway against a major amphibious assault. They had done more than that. They had broken the back of the Imperial Navy's carrier force without a single Japanese boot ever touching the sand. As the evening of June 7th approached, the famous Goonie birds, the Midway albatrosses, began to reclaim the islands. They landed among the wreckage of the seaplane hangar and waddled past the blackened fuel tanks, their clumsy, swaying dances a surreal contrast to the violence of the preceding days. To the Marines watching them from the trenches, the birds were a sign of the atoll's resilience. The war would move on. The front lines would shift thousands of miles to the south and west, toward places with names like Guadalcanal and Tarawa. But Midway would remain, a silent sentinel in the North Pacific. The Battle of Midway would eventually be recorded in the history books as the turning point of the war in the Pacific, the moment when the Japanese expansion was finally halted and the tide began to flow back toward the home islands of the rising sun. But for the defenders of the garrison, it was never about the grand strategic context. It was about the hand-pumped gasoline, the 50 caliber machine guns that grew too hot to touch, and the sight of a PBY coming home through the mist. As the last of the rescue missions returned and the sun set over the lagoon, the garrison of Midway stood at their stations for one more night. They were tired, they were grieving, and they were changed. They had been the undaunted defenders of a tiny speck of coral, and they had held the gate when the world was watching. The silence that now covered the atoll was not the silence of the forgotten, but the hard-won peace of a victory that had been paid for in the white sands and the deep blue of the Pacific. The gate was secure, and for the first time in 6 months, the men of Midway could look at the western horizon and see only the stars.